Hello, so this is for the subject Church Financial Management, and we are now going to discuss Chapter 3, Income Contributions. Okay, and then Chapter 4 would be Other Revenue Sources, so these two are related to each other. But we'll begin with Chapter 3. Let me just prepare my timer so that I would know when to cut. Mm-hmm. Okay. So for income contributions, in a way, this would appear in the income statement or statement of activities for the church, and it would show the revenue or the income or the contributions received by the church. So this pertains to money coming in or the cash inflow, which would form part of the church funds to be used for whatever purposes that they have. So it could be the conduct of church services or other activities such as missions, um, what else? Building and then acquisition of capital expenditures, building vehicles, furniture and fixtures, other equipment, and then you have your normal operations, the conduct of, let's say, what do you call it? Church services, Sunday school, chapel. You have your occasional activities such as you have the family retreat, DVVS, church anniversary, Thanksgiving, Lord's Supper, and others, right? And there's also the support for the missions or the Bible school. Okay. So again, I'd like to remind that the material is US based. So some of these things may be applicable in other countries as well, but as I browse the content, most of it would not be applicable in the Philippine setting. And so for the others who would also be going out in onto the mission field back into their country. So you might want to check the specific laws or the rules and regulations in the respective countries. Okay. Um, so for now, let's talk about contributions revenue. So for the most part, majority of the church income would come from the contributions of members, as well as contributions from the guests or the visitors attending the prayer meetings or the church service. Okay, and then there's the occasional call for special contributions, but normally that doesn't form part uh, of the normal operations of the church. Okay, so for the contributions, we have tithes, offerings, gifts, or any other term that would represent money received, okay, from members, visitors, and guests. Okay, so normally they're collected during service and they could be in the form of cash, checks. Other times they could be transferred directly to the bank accounts of the church if they desire. Normally, if the amount is small, then they could be received in cash. But if it's of a significant amount or it's quite a big contribution, so it might be better to write them as a check or again transfer directly to the bank of the church. Okay. So contributions come in a variety of flavors and colors. Again, either there's a box in the church, contribution box, or a plate or a bag or a bucket being passed around during service, and could receive cash, and then we have envelopes where you can put the checks, or just a note saying you've deposited it in the church bank account or something, right? So there's an author's note here about electronic giving. In a way, it's probably more safe in such that it's directly transferred to the bank account of the church. For the normal operations of the church, of course, we have what do you call it? Contributions being put into the offering bags, and then a church member, normally the treasurer or the cashier, would count the offering and then record them, and then eventually the next banking day they do deposit it in the bank account of the church. Okay, so direct deposits by a member to the church bank account would essentially be the same. Okay, but for recording purposes, they must inform the church management or the cashier or the treasurer that they did give their offering by direct deposit, so that the church would know um, how to record the transaction, or they would know that such money came into the bank, so that they would be able to reconcile the funds that are in the bank of the church, the bank account of the church. Okay. And then in chapter 2, we discussed modified cash basis in recording the contributions. Okay, so essentially, we normally record contributions as the church receives them in cash. Okay, only when they are properly received are they recorded. So pledges or expressions of intent to give. Okay, let's say for the missions, we have the faith promises, right? And then sometimes we are asked to record our commitments, giving commitments for the following year. In a way, it would help the church to prepare the budget for the next year. But recording wise, they don't record it as revenue or income already. Uh, until they are actually received by the church. Okay, so even if we do have the faith promise or the giving commitments, um, they are not what we record as revenue. We wait for it to be properly received by the church, and that's the only time that we actually record it. Okay, so in a way, it's cash basis. Okay, um, again, the situation of the members or the givers would change throughout the year. So sometimes they are able to, commit or to uh, give in accordance with their faith promise or giving commitments. But, sometimes situations change. They might be facing financial problems. So there might be months that they are unable to give in accordance with their pledges. So in that case, the church cannot depend on the faith promise or the commitments, right? So they must adjust their budget based on what they actually receive, and only use the amount that they do have on hand, or the money that they have actually received. Okay, so if there's any change or difference, they must adjust to that and be able to use what's only available. Okay, they cannot rely on something that's not yet received. Okay, by the church. Of course, they cannot use money that's not there yet. Okay, so essentially, pledges or intent to give are not yet recognized as revenue unless they are actually received by the church. Okay, that's the whole point or the main point of that uh, part of the discussion. And then we have donor restricted gifts. So we've discussed this in chapter 2. Essentially, gifts or donations or contributions wherein the giver or the donor provided restrictions. Okay, when there are restrictions, so the church can, what do you call it? If they do accept the donation, then they must adhere to the restriction. Example of restrictions again would be on which activity to use the donation, or if they can use the donation itself or just the profits of it. Okay, so there is that. Again, when it comes to donation, the church is not automatically, going to receive the donations. Um, it's possible that the church would reject a donation, especially if the restriction is, not in accordance with the belief of the church, or they cannot agree to the restriction being imposed by the donor. Okay, so I think one example that was um, provided by our pastor, I think a long time ago or a few years back, is that let's say a visitor donated a huge amount of money, but he was asking the pastor not to preach on vices like drinking or smoking. Okay, so that's the, what do you call that? It's a kind of restriction because there's such a request which would, in a way, disrupt the normal teachings of the church. So the pastor rejected the donation. It's a large amount of money, but if you're going to stop me from, preaching about smoking or about vices, then that would defeat the purpose of, the church and their commitment to preach the content of the Bible. So no thanks, right? So again, in the nation, especially here in the Philippines, there's what we call acceptance of the nation. So if there's no acceptance of the nation, essentially the donation did not happen, or there's no donation that occurred if there is no acceptance. And normally acceptance are written. Okay, written. There should be a written acceptance. Okay, the nation. Let's discuss taxation. Okay, donations are actually taxable, so an acceptance would be needed if the donor would like to, uh, you know, what do you call it? Not actually prove that the donation happened, but if they need to, what do you call that? Prove that their donation is within the threshold. The donor's tax is 6% of the donation, but only if it exceeds 100,000 pesos in a given year. Okay, so if a donor gives 100,000 for a given year, it's not going to be taxable. But if he exceeds that amount, let's say 110,000 pesos, so that would be taxed at 6%, and he has to pay the 6% donor's tax to the BIR or to the government. Okay. But if it's small amounts, less than 100,000 pesos, so they're not taxable, you don't need to declare that in your tax returns. Okay, so there's the, what do you call that, tax consequence of donating money. Okay, donations can be to an organization or an individual person. Okay, and then another thing about donations, the church, if a donation is made to the church, then the church management should normally, okay, restrictions can be accepted, okay, if it's, to be used to a particular activity of the church. But for it to restrict other things, like what to teach or who to give it to, and if the church would not be allowed to use it on their, the normal operations or their normal purpose, then again, it might not be accepted. So for example, the donor essentially, wanted to give it to a certain person, but they don't want to do it directly. They want it to be coursed through the church. Okay, so in that sense, the donation was not made to the church, so recording wise, it should not be recorded as the church receiving the donation, but it would be out of the books in such that it would not be recorded, because the church would receive the money and then, transfer it to a person probably needing financial assistance, or maybe a missionary asking for funds or whatever. So since the actual, or what do you call that? The actual beneficiary of the donation is not the church itself, so it would not be recorded as a receipt of the church, but just a transfer of the books would not be recorded. Okay, and then if it's to be used, or it's to be given to a specific church worker, then again, that's not a donation to the church, but to that particular person. So that would be off the books as well. Okay, would not be recorded. Next, gifts restricted for projects and programs are tax deductible. Gifts restricted for specific people are not. Okay. So again, if it's given to the church, then the donor may probably what do you call it? uh, Claim it as a tax deduction, but if it's given to specific people, they might be subject to donor's tax instead. Okay, so I'm going to cut this here because it's been 15 minutes already, and the file might not be saved if it's beyond that. Okay, so I'm gonna pause here and then continue with another video.